The wind out here did not feel like air. It felt like a rough hand, scraping sand across the world, like it was trying to wipe every living thing away. Sarah Layton kept walking anyway, one slow step after another, because stopping meant dying. Her lips were cracked, her throat burned. The sun above her was a hard white coin that never moved, and the land below was broken open like old clay. In her right hand, she carried a heavy black cast-iron skillet. It pulled at her arm like an anchor. In her left hand, she held a small deerskin pouch tight to her chest, as if it held her heart. The skillet was for survival. The pouch was for living. Hunger was not a sharp pain anymore. It was a cold, empty space that never went away. It made her thoughts thick and slow. It made the horizon look like a lie, but Sarah had not given in. As long as she had the skillet and the pouch, she still had a reason to keep moving. Near sundown, she stumbled into a place called Redemption. The name hung on a broken sign that swung on one rusty hinge, groaning with every gust of wind. The town looked dead. Buildings stood crooked with empty windows, like faces with no eyes. A saloon, a store, a blacksmith shop, all of them hollow, all of them quiet. The street was a wide stretch of dust with no tracks fresh enough to promise anyone was near. Sarah did not come for people. She came for water. In the center of the town, a wooden gallows stood like a dark finger pointing at the sky. Near it was the town well. The rope was frayed, and the bucket was gone. Sarah tied her own cord to a small tin pot and lowered it down. When she pulled it up, she got only a few inches of murky water. It tasted like metal and old dirt. She drank anyway, because it was life. Then she gathered scraps of dry wood from a collapsed porch. It broke in her hands like brittle bones. She stacked the pieces carefully in the dirt and struck a match, one of only 7 she had left. She cupped the flame with both hands, shielding it from the wind. The fire caught, small but steady, and the thin gray smoke rose into the evening like a fragile prayer. She set her skillet over the flames and opened the deerskin pouch. The smell that came out was not just spice. It was memory. It was her mother's kitchen. It was warmth in a world that had none. She had cumin, dried oregano, smoked chili powder, and one precious bay leaf. Her mother used to say food was more than fuel. It was love. It was comfort. With the right touch, you could make almost nothing feel like home. Sarah had a handful of hard pinto beans. She poured them into the skillet with a splash of water. They hissed against the hot iron. She added a pinch of salt, a dusting of cumin, and a little chili. She stirred slowly with a worn wooden spoon until the smell began to spread. In the dead heart of Redemption, that smell felt like a miracle. She ate in small bites, making it last. It did not fill her, not fully, but it quieted the ache enough for her to breathe without shaking. When she finished, she scrubbed the skillet with sand, her hands moving like she had done it 100 times. That was when a shadow fell over her fire. Sarah looked up fast. Her fingers tightened around the skillet handle, ready to swing. An old man stood there, hat pulled low, face lined deep like the land itself. His clothes were dusty. His hands were open, empty. He did not rush. He just stood and breathed in the air. After a long moment he spoke. "That's a smell I ain't smelled in this town for 20 years. Sarah stayed silent. Out here, trust could kill you. The old man took one slow step closer, careful like he knew fear lived in her bones. "That ain't just beans," he said. "That's a kitchen." "There's a difference." His eyes dropped to the pouch, then lifted back to her face. They were tired eyes, but clear, not drunk, not cruel, just worn down. "My name is Don Silvano," he said. "I'm passing through. Thought I'd rest where the ghosts are too tired to holler." He nodded toward her skillet. "I can pay if you got a spoonful left. Jerky, little bit." Sarah looked at him. She saw sadness in his face, but also decency. Slowly, she scraped the last beans onto her tin plate and held it out. "Keep your jerky," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "Food's meant to be shared." Quote. Don Silvano accepted the plate with a quiet nod. He ate slow, like every bite mattered. When he finished, he stared at the empty plate as if it was something holy. "My wife made beans like that," he said softly. "Made a man feel like he had a home, even if it was only a fire in the dirt. She's been gone 10 years. He lifted his eyes to Sarah again, and this time he looked at her like she was a person, not a stranger. "A woman who can cook like that don't belong in a place like this," he said. "This is where things end. You're more like beginnings." Sarah let out a short, bitter laugh. "Beginnings are long past for me," she said. "I'm just trying to find an ending that's warm." Don Silvano shook his head. "The world is hard, yes," he said, "but a skill like yours is real. It matters, and I know a place that might see that." Sarah's grip tightened on her pouch. The wind pushed at the dying fire. She listened, because she had nothing else left to listen to. "There's a ranch north of here," Don Silvano said. "Rancho Elmado, biggest ranch in this territory, run by a man named Ignasio Ramirez." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the way the old man said it made her stomach tighten. "He's the most feared rancher out here," Don Silvano continued. "Hard as January ice. Don't waste words. Some say he got no heart left. But he's fair, and he understands value. He's got men to feed, men tired of dry biscuits and salted beef." He leaned closer, lowering his voice like he was handing her something fragile. "A man like that might turn you away without looking," he said. "But if there's one thing he can't ignore, it's what a real meal does to a man." Sarah looked around the empty square, the gallows, the hollow buildings, the quiet that felt like a grave. This was an ending, if she stayed. She looked down at her skillet, then at her pouch. They were all she had. They were who she was. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Don Silvano's face softened, and it was like seeing the sun after a long storm. "2 days north," he said, pointing into the dark. "I'm heading that way myself. I can show you the road. After that, you're on your own." Sarah stared into the small fire and felt something stir inside her. Not hope. Hope was fragile. Hope could break. This was something harder. Purpose. She nodded once, sharp and sure. "All right," she said. "Lead the way." As the old man settled near the dying coals, Sarah lifted her mother's spice pouch to her face and breathed it in. Cumin, chili, oregano. A past she could never get back. But under it, faint as a new sunrise, she smelled something else. A future. And she did not know it yet. But 2 days from now she would stand before an iron gate, holding her skillet like a shield, staring into the cold eyes of the most feared rancher in the territory. And she would have only one sentence to save her life. Sarah reached the ranch by late afternoon, 2 days after Don Silvano left her at the fork in the road. The land had changed slowly as she walked. The wild desert gave way to fences and straight lines, like someone had put a ruler down on the earth and claimed it. A thin wire fence ran beside the road for miles, and Sarah could feel it like a warning. This was owned land. This was not a place for lost people. Then she saw the ranch. It sat in a shallow valley, sheltered by a stand of broad elm trees that threw cool shadows on the dust. The buildings were solid, made of adobe and dark timber, not like the broken shells of redemption. A large main house with a wide porch watched over everything like an eye that never blinked. There were bunkhouses, a barn, corrals full of horses, and a blacksmith forge with smoke curling into the sky. It looked like power. Sarah stopped at the gate. It was heavy black iron with sharp points on top. A wooden arch stood above it, carved deep with the ranch name. The gate was closed. The world inside moved with quiet order. The world outside was only dust and her own thin shadow. She waited. A rider finally came, a young ranch hand on a nervous horse. He looked down at her like she was something the wind had blown in. "What do you want?" he asked. "I'm here to see Mr. Ramirez," Sarah said. The young man almost laughed. "The boss don't see drifters." "I'm not a drifter," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I'm a cook." His eyes dropped to the skillet in her hand, then to the pouch against her chest. He did not look convinced, but he hesitated. "Wait here," he muttered. He rode off toward the main house, Sarah stood under the hot sun as time dragged like a chain. She felt eyes on her from the bunkhouse in the barn. Men watched her from the shade. She did not move. She did not rattle the gate. She just waited, because this was her last road. Then, the main house door opened. A man stepped onto the porch and walked forward. The ranch grew quiet as if it knew who he was. Work paused. Voices fell. Even the horses seemed to settle. He moved with slow control, like a man who never hurried because he never had to. This was Ignasio Ramirez. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed plain, no fancy gun belt or bright silver. His authority did not hang from his hips. It lived in him. His face was weathered, but not worn down. It was hard, like stone that could not be shaped. His dark hair was threaded with gray, and his eyes were cold and sharp, the color of a storm sky. He stopped a few feet from the gate and looked at Sarah like she was a tool someone had left on the ground. His gaze traveled over her worn boots, her torn dress, the dirt on her face, the skillet, the pouch. It was not a rude stare. It was an inventory. He spoke in a low voice, flat and final. "We give nothing away here." The words hit Sarah like a shove. Her throat went dry. For a second, she felt the old fear rise, the fear that said run, hide, disappear. She saw his body shift, like he was already finished with her, like he was about to turn away. She could not let that happen. She thought of her mother's hands and the smell in that pouch. She thought of Don Silvano's words. "It was the smell of your cooking that opened the door." Sarah lifted her chin and met Ignasio's cold eyes. "I'm not asking for a gift, sir," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried. "I know I'm not worth much," she whispered, and the truth of it burned her tongue. Then she said the only thing she owned in this world. "But I can cook." Ignacio stopped moving. For the first time, his eyes did not look through her. They focused. He glanced at the skillet, then the pouch, then back to her face. He stood silent long enough for Sarah to feel her heartbeat in her throat. He was not a kind man. She could see that. But he was a rancher. He understood value. He understood what kept men working. He understood what made a hard day feel possible. Finally, he gave a slight nod, like he had made a decision in his head. He turned his head toward the young ranch hand who waited nearby. "Show her the cookhouse," Ignacio said. Then he looked back at Sarah. "The men eat when the sun touches that western ridge," he said. "There will be 10 of them. Cook for them." And with that he turned and walked away like the matter was done. The young ranch hand opened the gate just enough for her to pass. Sarah stepped through. The gate shut behind her with a heavy final sound that made her stomach twist. She was inside now, but it did not feel safe. It felt like she had walked into a test she could not fail. The young man led her across the yard to a long, low building and shoved the door open. "This is it," he said. "Stove, pantry, water pump out back. Name's Leo." He looked her up and down one last time, half pity and half doubt. "The boss wasn't joking," he added. "Sun hits that ridge. They'll be here." Then he left, and the door closed, sealing her inside. The cookhouse smelled like old grease and stale smoke. It was big and empty feeling, built for work, not comfort. A huge iron stove sat along one wall like a dead animal. Tables were scarred with knife marks. Shelves held sacks and tins stacked high. It was a place that had fed men, but it had never cared about them. Sarah set her skillet on the table. The solid thud echoed in the room. For a moment she stood very still. Cooking for herself from a handful of beans was one thing. Cooking for 10 hungry ranch hands in a strange kitchen with unknown supplies was another. Her hands shook once. Then she forced them to stop. She began with the fire. The stove belly was full of ash. She cleaned it out with steady movements and laid kindling inside. She struck one of her precious matches. The flame caught and she coaxed it until the wood took and the heat began to rise. The stove woke with a deep, low roar, and warm air pushed back the cold smell of the room. Then she opened the pantry. It was full of survival food. Sacks of beans and flour, potatoes and onions, salt pork and slabs of salted beef, coffee, lard, Nothing fresh, nothing green, nothing soft. But Sarah did not see limits. She saw tools. Beans would take too long. She needed something that would be ready by sundown and fill a man's belly with comfort. She chose a thick stew, rich and heavy, the kind that stuck to a man's ribs. She filled a bucket at the water pump, cold, clear water splashing into the metal like music. She washed her hands hard, scrubbing away the road, and the act felt like stepping into a new life. She cut salted beef into thick cubes. She peeled onions, eyes burning from the sharp scent. She scrubbed potatoes and chopped them into rough chunks. She set a big iron pot on the stove and melted lard until it shimmered. Then the beef went in. It sizzled loud, and the smell of searing meat filled the cookhouse like a promise. She browned it in batches, careful not to crowd the pot. She wanted deep flavor, not gray meat. When the beef was done, she cooked the onions in the hot fat until they turned soft and sweet. Then she opened her pouch. The scent rose warm and familiar. She pinched cumin and chili and oregano between her fingers and sprinkled it into the pot. She toasted the spices in the onion fat, waking them up, letting them bloom. The smell changed right away. It grew deeper, richer, alive. It was the smell of home, creeping into a place that had forgotten it. She returned the beef to the pot, added potatoes, poured in water, and dropped in her single bay leaf like a quiet prayer. She covered the pot and lowered the heat. Now the stew needed time. While it simmered, she made biscuits. Simple flour, salt, lard, water. Quick hands, light touch. She shaped them and slid them into the oven. The sun began to drop. The western ridge outside the window turned gold, then orange, then dark, and then the cookhouse door creaked open. 10 men walked in. They were dusty, lean, sunburned, and hungry. They moved in a line, silent and watchful. Their eyes took in the pot, the warmth, the smell, and then they looked at her. Sarah's chest tightened. This was the moment that decided everything. She lifted the lid from the stew pot. Steam rolled out thick and fragrant, carrying beef and onion and spice into the room. She took a ladle and began to serve. She filled tin plates with stew and set biscuits beside it. The men sat at the long tables. And then came the silence. No jokes, no talk, only spoons scraping tin, slow and steady. They ate like men who had forgotten food could be anything but fuel. Sarah stood near the stove, hands clasped tight, watching their faces. One man closed his eyes for a brief moment after a bite, like he was trying to remember something. Another wiped his plate clean with his biscuit. 2 men stood up and served themselves a second, helping without a word. Clean plates began to stack. The silence was not angry. It was heavy with focus. It was respect without words. Then the door opened again. Ignasio Ramirez stepped inside. The room changed at once. Men sat straighter. Even the air felt tight. Ignasio walked to the pot, served himself, and sat at the head of the table. He ate slow, calm, and unreadable. Sarah felt every bite he took like a verdict. He finished. His plate was clean. He set his spoon down like a man closing a book. Then he lifted his eyes to her. "Who have you cooked for before?" he asked. Sarah swallowed. She had no fancy answer, no rich house, no big ranch, only truth. "My mother, sir," she said, "and myself." Ignasio held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, small and final. He stood and turned toward Leo. "Give her the small room behind the storeroom," he said. "A blanket and a lamp." He walked out without another word. Leo led her to a tiny windowless room with a narrow cot. It smelled of dust and dried herbs. It was empty, but it had a door that closed. When Sarah lit the lamp, the small space filled with soft, warm light. She sat on the cot with the blanket in her lap, exhausted in a way she could not explain. She had not been welcomed. She had not been praised. She had simply been allowed to stay. But as she closed her eyes, she could still smell the stew on her clothes. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she knew where she would sleep tomorrow night. Outside, the ranch settled into night sounds, horses shifting, men talking low in the bunkhouse. Sarah clutched her spice pouch and listened. Somewhere in the dark, a new life had opened its door, and she could feel, deep in her bones, that the hardest part was still coming. The days at Rancho Elmado fell into a hard rhythm. Sarah rose before sunrise and brought the great iron stove back to life. She baked, simmered, stirred, and cleaned until her arms ached. At sunrise, noon, and sunset, the men filed in, ate in silence, and went back to horses and cattle and dust. They did not insult her. They did not praise her. They treated her like a tool that worked well, and on this ranch, that was a kind of respect. But when the cookhouse door closed, Sarah still felt alone. Then, one morning, before the sky was even fully light, she found something on the stone step outside the cookhouse door. It was a small sprig of wild oregano, placed there with care, fresh enough that its scent rose sharp and clean when she picked it up. Sarah stood still, the cold air in her lungs, and looked out across the quiet yard. No one was there. She brought the oregano inside and laid it on the table like it was a message. That day, she noticed one of the men more clearly than she had before. His name was Julian. He worked with the horses. He moved with quiet gentleness, like he could calm a frightened animal with nothing but his presence. He was different from the others because he did not speak at all. Julian was mute. His silence made him an outsider, and Sarah felt that truth like a familiar bruise. That evening, she crushed the wild oregano between her fingers and rubbed it into the salted beef before she cooked it. The smell changed the whole room. When the men ate, no one said a word, but Sarah watched Julian take his first bite. He chewed slowly, then lifted his eyes to hers for one brief moment. There was no smile, no show, just a clear look that said he understood. The gifts kept coming, always on the step before dawn. Wild onions, a handful of mushrooms, peanut nuts. Sarah used them carefully, turning plain food into something that felt alive. The men did not know why meals tasted better, but their plates came back cleaner, and the silence at the table began to feel less empty. One afternoon, Sarah saw Julian by the water trough, his left hand wrapped in a bloody rag. She pointed to it. He hesitated, then unwrapped it to show a deep cut across his palm. Sarah brought warm water, salt, and clean cloth. She cleaned the wound and wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from a flour sack. Julian flinched from the sting, but he did not pull away. When she finished, he gave a small nod of thanks, and the bond between them settled into place without a single word. Peace held for a while, and then it broke. A buckboard rolled into the yard one Tuesday morning, carrying a woman dressed in black from collar to hem. Her gray hair was pulled tight. Her face looked carved from dry wood. This was Donna Leah, Ignasio Ramirez's aunt, a woman from the ranch's past, who returned like a shadow. She stepped into the cookhouse and looked around with cold disapproval. She saw the clean tables, the ordered shelves, the steady fire, and her mouth tightened as if the sight offended her. "So this is the drifter Ignacio led into my kitchen," she said. Sarah kept working. She did not argue. She turned 2 sage grouse in her skillet, their skins sizzling in hot fat. Donna Leah moved like a judge, tapping her cane, sniffing at tins, peering into sacks, searching for something to condemn. When she spoke again, her voice sharpened. "What do you know of feeding real men?" she said, "with desert dirt still under your nails?" Sarah reached for her spice pouch and, without thinking, used a small pinch of her mother's special blend. Cinnamon, a hint of clove, and dried orange peel. When it hit the hot fat, the smell lifted into the room like a spirit. Donna Leah froze. Her cane stopped mid-tap. Her eyes narrowed, then widened, and the anger on her face cracked into something raw and confused. "What is that smell?" she demanded, her voice suddenly thin. "Where did you get that?" Sarah kept cooking, spooning hot fat over the browning birds. The scent grew stronger, Donna Leah took a step closer, as if pulled by the memory. "That is my recipe," she whispered, and the words trembled. "No one has cooked that in this kitchen for 15 years. Her face twisted, and the pain beneath her bitterness pushed up like a wound reopening. Then she snapped back into anger because anger was easier than grief. "You have no right," she said, raising her cane. "You come here from nothing, and you dare to cook my memories." At that moment, Julian appeared in the doorway with firewood in his arms. He stopped, startled, eyes moving between the old woman and Sarah. Sarah finally turned from the stove. She did not see a monster in Donna Leah. She saw a woman drowning in old sorrow. "I'm not trying to steal anything, ma'am," Sarah said softly. "I'm just trying to remind people what warmth tastes like." The words landed like a quiet blow. Donna Leah's cane lowered. Her mouth opened, but no answer came. A dry sob escaped her throat. She turned and fled, pushing past Julian as if the smell itself was chasing her. After that, Donna Leah stayed away from the cookhouse. The ranch returned to its rhythm, but something had shifted. Sarah understood she was not only feeding hungry men, she was feeding ghosts. She was feeding grief. She was feeding places inside people that had gone cold. Weeks later, a traveling merchant arrived with a pack mule and tired eyes. He spoke with Ignacio on the porch, then asked a question that made Sarah's heart jump. "I was told there's a new cook here," the merchant said. "A young woman, Sarah Layton." When he found Sarah, he held out a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "An old man named Don Silvano gave me this," he said. "Said if I ever met a girl who could make magic from a spice pouch, I was to give it to her." Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, stained and worn. But the writing stopped her breath. It was her mother's hand. At the top, in looping script, were 2 words that made tears blur her sight. "Christmas tamales." It was not just a recipe. It was her mother's voice. It was love, pressed into ink. Sarah held the paper to her chest and sat down hard, as if her knees forgot how to stand. She read every line like a prayer. The next morning, she began the work. Tamales were not quick food. They were celebration food. They were the kind of meal that asked for patience and care. She soaked corn husks in a barrel. She chose the best cut of pork and simmered it with chilies, garlic, onion, and spice. Then she added cinnamon, and the cookhouse filled with a smell the ranch had never known. Men drifted near the door, pretending they had a reason to be there. Their faces were wary, curious. Sarah did not speak much. Her hands stayed busy. She kneaded masa until it turned light. She shredded the pork. She spread, filled, and folded each husk like she was wrapping a secret. When the tamales steamed, the air grew thick with comfort. That night, she served 2 tamales to each man. They did not know what to do at first. Sarah told them gently to unwrap them. Rough hands peeled back the husks. Steam rose. The first bite changed the room. Silence fell, deeper than Sarah had ever heard in that cookhouse. It was not empty silence. It was full of surprise and something close to wonder. Even Jebediah, the oldest and hardest to please, chewed slowly, then lifted his eyes and gave Sarah one slow nod. Sarah felt her chest tighten with something she could barely name. For one moment, that cookhouse was not a workroom. It was a home. Then the night broke open. A terrible scream tore through the dark, not human, but the high, panicked shriek of a horse. Sarah woke and ran outside to see the stable on fire. Flames punched through the roof. Smoke rolled into the sky. Horses screamed from inside. Men poured from the bunkhouse half-dressed, shouting, pointing, frozen by the size of the disaster. Ignasio Ramirez stepped onto the porch, already dressed, face lit by the burning orange light. And he did nothing. He stood like stone, eyes wide, staring at the flames as if seeing another night, another fire, another loss. The men looked to him, waiting for orders. None came. Fear spread through them like sickness. Sarah's stomach turned cold, but her mind went clear. She had survived hunger and dust. She knew what freezing meant. It meant death. "The horses!" she shouted. "We have to get the horses out." Heads turned. Men stared at her like they did not know who she was. Sarah pointed at Leo and Jebediah. "Get axes. Break the far corral fence so they have somewhere to run. The rest of you, with me. We get those doors open." Her voice gave the men a path, and a path gave them courage. They ran. The stable doors burned hot, but men threw their shoulders into them until the bars snapped and the doors flew open. Heat blasted out. Smoke clawed at their throats. Sarah tore strips of cloth to cover horses' eyes. She spoke low to them, steady, as if calming fire instead of animals. One by one, horses burst out into the yard, wild with terror, then bolted toward the broken fence and the open dark beyond. Julian worked inside the smoke with grim focus, trying to free Ignacio's prized black stallion. The horse fought and screamed. Then the roof groaned. A burning beam cracked loose and fell. Sarah saw it too late. The beam struck near Julian, and a heavy burning piece hit his leg. Julian went down hard, face twisted in pain, leg bent wrong. The stallion finally broke free and ran. Sarah's whole body screamed to rush to Julian, but she forced herself to keep shouting orders because if she stopped, the men would stop. "Get him out!" she yelled. They dragged Julian away, just as more of the roof collapsed in a roar of fire. Sarah turned back to the yard, formed a bucket line, and fought to keep embers from taking the bunkhouse. The wind shifted near dawn, pushing smoke away just enough for them to win. When the sun rose, the stable was a black skeleton. But the ranch still stood. The men still breathed. The horses were alive. Sarah stood in the yard, soot covering her skin, dress torn, muscles shaking from exhaustion. Julian lay by the trough, legs splinted, eyes on her. Even through pain, he managed a small, grateful smile. On the porch, Ignacio still stood where he had frozen all night. But his eyes were different now. They were clear, and they were fixed on Sarah, as if he was seeing her for the first time. That morning, Sarah lit the cookhouse fire again and made a simple healing soup. Bacon, onions, potatoes, carrots. She carried the first bowl to Julian and helped him sit up. He held it close, breathing in the steam like it was medicine. Later, Ignasio came into the cookhouse. He stopped in front of Sarah, his voice lower than usual, rougher. "The ranch would have been lost," he said. "You saved it." Then, as if it hurt him to do it, he said two quiet words that changed the air in the room. "Thank you." After that, Donalea came to the cookhouse, not angry, only tired. She smelled the soup and stared into the pot like she was staring into a past she could not change. "When the old ranch house burned," she said, "my mother made this same soup for the survivors." She looked at Sarah and spoke in a strange, honest way. "You cook as if you are feeding ghosts." Sarah's voice stayed soft. "Sometimes the ghosts are the hungriest." Donalea gave one stiff nod, not an apology, but something close to respect, and left. The ranch rebuilt itself board by board. Men spoke to Sarah now, small words, simple thanks. Julian healed slowly, spending hours on a bench near the cookhouse, and one day he returned with a tin can holding a living chili plant. He offered it to her with quiet hope in his eyes. Sarah knelt by the south wall of the cookhouse and dug into the hard dirt. She planted the chili, then pressed her own saved seeds into the damp earth around it. Cilantro. Thyme. 3 chili seeds from her mother's past. Roots from Julian's present. A future growing in the same soil. One evening, Ignasio came into the cookhouse and placed a folded document on the table. It was a deed. "It gives you title to this cookhouse and the land it sits on," he said. "Half the provisioning business is legally yours." Sarah stared at the paper like it might vanish. "Why?" she whispered. Ignasio's face stayed hard, but his eyes carried a truth he had kept buried for years. "My first ranch burned 15 years ago," he said. "My wife and my son were inside. I was the only one who got out. The words were plain, but they cut deep. Sarah understood then why his eyes had held a ghost, why he froze at the fire. That night, he continued, I watched it happen again, and I did nothing. But you ran into the fire. You took command. You held this place together when I could not. He took a slow breath. I do not need a cook, he said. I need a partner. Sarah looked out the window at her small garden patch, the tiny green shoots pushing through earth that used to be dead. She thought of her mother's recipe. She thought of Julian's silent gifts. She thought of the gate closing behind her and the fear that she would never belong anywhere. She lifted her eyes to Ignasio. Yes, she said. The words settled in the room like a stone set in the ground. Solid, true. The next morning, Julian hung a carved sign above the cookhouse door. The letters were deep and proud, and above them he had carved a single flame. El Fuego de Maria. Sarah touched the wood, and for the first time in years, she smiled without forcing it, because she had crossed the desert with nothing but a skillet and a pouch of spices. And now, in this hard land of dust and fire, she had a name on a door, roots in the ground, and a place that finally felt like home.